In this chapter, we will speak about parameters such as the query or parameters in the body or the header. So there are various parameters that you can use. To call an API, for example, sometimes you require query parameters, and that's typically what you would see at the end of an API call in the browser, like the question mark, and the example here, user ID equals user / ID. It's very often also required to send something in the body, like a payload, that's typically in JSON format. And sometimes it's even required to have a variable in the path, and the path may be then depending upon a number of things. Azure AD is a good example, which we'll explain later, where it's expecting a user ID for queries. And then, of course, you also have the headers, mainly being used for authentication, but also other attributes like content type and content length, etc. The example, as you can see here, is Graph API from Microsoft for Azure AD or to manage Azure AD. And that's very often requiring path parameters, but also query parameters and sometimes even body. So the example that you see here on the second line, where you query for the users, it expects a user ID for the authentication or authorization, but it may also expect some extra parameters, like the query parameters to select for filtering or what kind of things you would like to have returned, etc. So we need to have a way, of course, to define those variables. They could be fixed, but very often they're in a way variable, or they may be changing every time, like the body and the query parameters and so on. So we need to have a way in flows to define those parameters. Well, let's give some examples. So let's create a form with some examples of parameters. As you know, I have this long list of known API calls and collections like Amazon, and then you have certain C operations, so all calls, endpoints that you could call. But we also have a generic one available to create here, and that's actually when you don't have any known endpoints in our list, you can create your own one. You simply use this create button here and drag and drop it in the flow. It may require some authorization, but just for now, I'm going to use a hostname example.com, and I'm going to assume that is as a base path of version 2, and it requires, for example, users, and this could be a query already that could return some things. But let's assume that I also need to add something to the body. Let's assume that the path would be user by name, and the body is expecting a JSON with the username. I can click here on map, parameters, and now we can choose a parameter. In the drop-down list here, you will find the various parameters that you could use: path, header, body, query, form. And I'm going to use the body. Already exists. I'm going to close this. And here I could now enter the JSON. For example, that could be user name and the name, and close the body parameter. So if I would run this now, it will obviously fail because we are using a fictive endpoint. But at the end, we can see what's been sent to that endpoint. So we have sent to that URL, and in the body, you can find the JSON with the username, the name. Now it's also possible that you require some query parameters. Right? Remember the question mark something. That's also something obviously that you can map. We can create a query parameter, and we call it the query. And I'm going to say something to query. Let's run this again. And look at the result. And we'll find here that we have sent again to the endpoint the body, but now we also have query parameters, the query. So in reality, what we will send will be to this endpoint question mark, the query equals something to query. Like we said, it's also possible that you require a path parameter. How can you enter that path parameter? Well, simply in between curly brackets, you give it the path variable, for example, path_var, and in the mapping, I would create this time a parameter of the location path, and I need to call it, need to give the same name, and I could now say the user's path, for example. So make sure that the name of the parameter is the one that you're using here in between curly brackets. Let's run this. Complete running, and let's take a look at what's been sent. As you can see here, oh, I've done something wrong. Path_var, I think I gave it the wrong name. Path_var mappings. The path should have been, of course, path_var. Let's run it again. You see how easy it is to make mistakes, of course. Okay. The API call, what have we sent? And you can see here now the user path, which was stored in that path variable. Still, of course, the body is there, and still the query with the elements are there. And of course, you can do the same thing for header, for elements in the form, etc.